Well, we're going to get started with our first panel and discussion. As you saw, as you may have seen in the American Project document, the order itself begins, the Way Forward document begins with this statement. The American political system suffers from a serious but treatable disorder. We see the most obvious symptoms easily enough, ranging from political polarization and radicalization to apathy and civic disengagement, leading many to wonder if we are coming apart. The malady itself is a profound, pervasive alienation, where citizens have lost our connections to politics and each other. We are experiencing a modern loneliness so acute as to threaten what we call the American Project. And then I'll just read a couple sentences of the next paragraph. The American Project represents the distilled core of a long American tradition, and it is the essential common ground of our national understanding, one that invites all into a connective history and a set of rights and responsibilities. With deep roots in Western civilization, the American Project is grounded in the conviction that the capacity for self-government is a source of a distinctly human dignity, one that in America produced an exceptional and peculiarly American governing document, the U.S. Constitution. Related, this right and ability to pursue happiness requires energetic social and political institutions, from schools and houses of worship to workplaces and political parties, to supply moral order and to speak to our deep human needs for virtue and belonging. The collapse of these community-building institutions has led directly to a severe questioning of what it means to be an American, with a looming threat of losing any sense of our common American identity. We have set the bar low for our conversations here. And as the document is organized, so are the panels going forward. And so we are beginning with, on a premise, that we are in fact experiencing this period of homelessness and alienation. And we're going to have to prove that. Whether it's 23andMe or other things that we're hearing or watching on television, I think it might be evident to some of us. But I think one of the things that's unique about this period of time is this subject of loneliness has come under significant exploration in the social sciences. And so that's why I'm so excited for our first speaker here to begin the conversation with essentially defining what this all means. Dr. Francie Brookhammer is a resident physician at the University of California at Irvine Medical Center. She has worked on this issue along with her mentor and colleague at UCI, Dr. Aaron Cariardi, who coined the phrase deaths of despair to look at the growing number of premature deaths in the United States related to issues of disconnection and alienation. So the format for this first part is that Francie is going to begin with an overview of these issues, the analysis that we know of on loneliness in the United States, and then we will enter into a conversation that we will invite your questions to. And so without any further ado, please welcome our first speaker of the conference, Dr. Francie Brookhammer.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me today. Let's be honest, you couldn't imagine a more beautiful place or a more beautiful day to be having this kind of somber conversation, right? But beyond that, it actually provides me so much hope to see all of these great minds and kind hearts in a room willing to discuss such a challenging topic. Increasingly in America, we're very individualistic. We flee from uncomfortable conversations and feeling out of place. But I see in front of me a room full of people that says, let's sit down, let's talk about what makes us uncomfortable, and let's try to find some solutions. And this is exactly what we need. So thank you. The conversation I am here to continue today is one that was started by Ann Case and Angus Deaton, who are two economists out of Princeton. One of them has won the Nobel Prize for this work, actually. And their work has been on the deaths of despair, which they actually termed, I apologize. And it refers to the increasing number of deaths we see due to suicide, drug overdoses, and alcohol-related deaths. And there's a number of things, social underpinnings at play that are contributing to these deaths. And they're things that we all need to be taking into account as we consider how we can best structure America as a whole. But from a medical perspective, I do want to take a step back and give you a little bit of background on suicide and depression and what all of this means to help put it in context. So, suicide is now the number 2 cause of death for our adolescents. It's the number 10 cause of death for Americans as a whole. In 2016, 45,000 people committed suicide. We get so used to seeing these numbers that we become numb to them, but I encourage you to consider that number, 45,000. Behind every single one of those people is a bunch of family and loved ones who are left distraught, questioning, and in pain. So it's not just a number, it's far more than that. Suicide is a uniquely human behavior. There's a fallacy out there that lemurs also commit suicide, but that's now actually been proven to be false. In order to commit suicide, you have to have a sense of self-awareness that only humans possess. You have to be able to be introspective and say, this is what I'm experiencing right now. It's uncomfortable for me, I don't like it. And in addition to that, you have to have the ability to look forward and say, I don't think it's gonna get better. And therefore, my solution is to remove myself from this situation overall. Many other species, all other species, do not possess this ability. So it is a uniquely human behavior. And what we know is that suicide is affecting everyone across America. All age groups under the age of 75 have experienced increased rates of suicide. It's happening in almost every state, at almost every age demographic. We are seeing spiking suicide rates amongst teenagers and amongst our middle-aged Americans, in particular, our Caucasian, working class, middle-aged males who do not have a bachelor's degree, which is actually a unique subset that hopefully we'll be able to tap into a little bit later. And what's also important to consider when we talk about suicide is that it's not an isolated event. It's not that someone commits suicide and it's unfortunate and we move on. Someone commits suicide and people 3 degrees removed from that person are affected by that suicide, which means it's not just the individual, it's their friend, it's their friend's friend, and it's their friend's friend, which makes sense when you start to consider some things that have gone on recently, in particular Kate Spade, Anthony Bourdain. Those were likely tied to each other, and we can discuss that a little more as well if you'd like. Now, what we know is that people don't typically commit suicide out of the blue. Often it arises from an underlying state of depression. This can be a clinically diagnosed depression, it can be a depression due to an underlying medical disorder, or maybe a depression due to another mental illness, such as schizophrenia or bipolar. According to the World Health Organization, depression is now the leading medical and mental illness plaguing Americans today. And we know that depression is the #1 cause of disability worldwide. When you look at the top 3 classes of medications that are prescribed in America, your first one are those for cardiovascular health, those that'll help your blood pressure and cholesterol. Your second is antidepressants. And your third are pain medications, in particular opioids. And I think that says a lot about where we are as a society and what's facing us and what's plaguing us. Now, the problem with depression is that the very core of the illness perpetuates itself. When you're in a state of depression, an incredible loneliness and despair, even if someone is reaching out and saying, I'm here to help, the illness itself prevents you from fully embracing that help or realizing the support that's around you. So it becomes this self-perpetuating illness in a lot of ways and makes it very challenging to treat. The other thing that we should consider with depression is that depression in and of itself, while a problem, is not ultimately what is causing people to end their life. It's hopelessness. Because pain without hope is lethal. We know that Americans, or people in general, can actually endure a superhuman amount of pain. as long as they know there's a reason for this suffering or there's light at the end of the tunnel. But you take that away, and what's the point of this suffering? And that's where we get into trouble. I'll bring up the book Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl at this point. He was in the Nazi internment camps, and he wrote a little memoir about what he experienced both personally and on a broader level when he was there. And as you can imagine, an incredible amount of pain and suffering was present in these camps. And they could tell. When one of his peers lost hope, he could tell. They had a German word that was the rough equivalent of the Walking Dead. And he said that you could see the lights go out in someone's eyes when they gave up hope. And in the days or weeks following that, inevitably something would happen. Maybe they'd fall victim to an illness, they'd step out of line and get shot, or do something that was unorthodox, so they would be pushed into these gas chambers earlier than they would have been otherwise. But essentially, his observation, which holds true today, is that when people lost hope, death was often not far behind. Now, segueing into what I think will be the body of our conversation today and this weekend is that depression is the body's response to a toxic environment. So why on earth is the environment so toxic? What is going on here? And there's a lot of things at play that we'll delve into when you look at the economy, the family, technology. There's so much going on. But two overarching themes that came out when we started to research this was that we're not connected anymore. We live in an incredible state of isolation, and because of that, we're lonely. Americans are facing an epidemic of loneliness at the core. Since the turn of the century, Americans now report that they're 40% more lonely than they were. And that's defined as not having a meaningful interaction in your life. Perhaps more important than that, I would argue, is that 20% of Americans say they don't have someone they could turn to if they were going through a difficult time. So consider yourself, consider the person in front of you, behind you, and on either side of you. That means one person you just considered doesn't have someone in their life that they could turn to when they were struggling. If you want to talk about preconditions for depression and suicide, that's got to be at the top of your list, right? We're not living in community anymore. We're isolated, and we don't have people who can give us meaning and provide hope, and that's a problem. I'll share with you one somber story before we transition. And the New Yorker in the early 2000s put out an article called The Jumper. It's a good article. If you haven't read it, I would recommend it. And it looked at the Golden Gate Bridge, which is the #1 suicide hotspot in America. And it told the story of a man who unfortunately took his life via jumping. Following his death, the medical examiner and a psychiatrist went to his home. They were going through his belongings. They found a journal entry. The journal entry outlined all the pain and the isolation he'd been experiencing. He said, "I cannot take it anymore. I'm going to go to the bridge. I'm going to jump. But if one person smiles at me on the walk from my apartment to the bridge, I won't do it." So what does that say about where we are as a society and how we're interacting with people and what needs to change? So with that being said, I'll put forward a couple ideas and things that we've noticed, Dr. Cariotti and I, in our research that are strongly underpinning a lot of this. The social fabric, if you will, that's coming apart and allowing people to slip through the cracks in this way. First are changes in employment. There's a fair amount of job insecurity at play here, financial insecurity, which then in turn is affecting identities, security in the home, how effective and stable marriages are. That has many downstream effects. And this is, especially when we consider our working middle-aged male who's facing one of the steepest increases in their suicide rates of anyone, is a very important topic to consider. Another topic worth considering is the family dynamic as a whole. As you know, our divorce rates kind of plateaued, which is great. But people also aren't getting married at the same rate that they were before. Our rates of cohabitation are increasing. We're having children out of wedlock. There's a lot of fluidity in the home. So what does that look like, and how is that affecting people? Next, I'll encourage you to consider social connections and the role that they have here. Social media obviously comes into play here, and the role of technology, how we're more connected than we've ever been, but we somehow feel farther apart. And also, what are we not doing because we're spending so much time with our technology? What are we sacrificing? Family dinners, spending time with our neighbors, those kind of annoying bunko nights that do have some value. And also, what's the role of religion and spirituality in this? We know that increasingly Americans are pulling away from organized religion. And what does that mean? How is that affecting us? And can we maybe turn to a more individualized relationship with our religion and still have it provide these health benefits as a whole? That's a question worth asking. And finally, something else worth bringing up, although not directly contributing, is the opioid crisis, because it's on everyone's mind. And I'm going to argue that the opioid crisis is not the core issue here. It's actually everything else downstream of that that's causing people to turn to these drugs of addiction. And what we know is that people are either taking their lives in the short term via suicide, or in the long term over a slower period of time via drugs of abuse and alcohol. So in total, what we know is that the fabric of our lives are slowly beginning to come apart. What we used to identify ourselves by, how we used to connect and interact with each other, it's changing, and not necessarily for the better, as we're seeing reflected in these increasing rates of depression, anxiety, suicide, isolation. So we're losing our identity, our security, our meaning, and ultimately our hope. And as I touched on earlier, hope is one of the most important things for the individual. So I remain hopeful today that we can start a conversation worth talking about and start to influence change.
Great, Francie. Thank you so much for kicking us off on such an important note. So I wanted to begin with a quotation from a book by one of the great Californians, Dr. Robert Nisbet, who wrote a book called The Quest for Community. Mm-hmm. I wanted to read the first two lines, two sentences from this book under the title, The Loss of Community. One may paraphrase the famous words of Karl Marx and say that a specter is haunting the modern mind, the specter of insecurity. Surely the outstanding characteristic of contemporary thought on man and society is the preoccupation with personal alienation and cultural disintegration. Now, he wrote this in 1953. And so it could be argued, as I've seen it argued, that this is just kind of Western navel-gazing, right? That this discussion around alienation has been something that's been going on for decades, if not centuries. And so I wanted to begin with trying to take that argument on and see where it's valid and where you see us really being in a unique place and time as it relates to these measures of alienation and loneliness. Any sense as to what makes now different?
Yes. So we know that this has been an issue for a long time. It's obviously dating back decades, been on people's minds. We're meant to live in community with each other, right? You look at how early families were set up. The woman would stay home with the child and the man would go out and get food. That's a symbiotic relationship. No man is an island. So we know as soon as we start to drift towards existing as an island, we're in trouble. We're not meant to live that way. We can't successfully exist that way. But there's a couple things going on right now that are different, that are pushing us towards this island, if you will. And I think the biggest one that comes to mind currently is technology. We're more isolated than we've ever been because of it. And there's this underpinning, this idea that we're individualistic, right? This is my relationship with my work. This is my relationship with my family. And we're starting to compartmentalize our lives in a way that we necessarily weren't able to do in the past because taking on all of this was too much. But technology, having, your groceries can be delivered, everything can be streamlined, it makes it seem like, well, maybe I could do it all. So why don't I try? And social media is a part of that, but by and large, we're starting to transition to, you should be able to do this all. And I think that's a scary transition because at no other point in history have we said, I think I can do it all.
I wanted to look at work. In our A Way Forward document, we talk about the importance of work as one of our grounding principles. And see it not just as a place of financial benefit, but actually to see work as a civic institution. That's how we define it in the document. And Vivek Murthy, who probably knows was President Obama's Surgeon General, has been talking a lot about this problem of loneliness. And I wanted to quote something from a piece he wrote recently in the Harvard Business Review, in which he writes, and I quote, "Work and the loneliness epidemic is based on the fact that not only, even in some of these work offices that are open space, people are still continuing to be focused on their technology, laptops, and computers. And so I wanted to look at work as one of the elements, as an institution that for centuries has been a point of connection, that even in places where we see these open office environments and the thought that we're doing all this collaborating, that the opposite might really be true. If you could talk a little bit about
Absolutely.
how work might be beyond, I mean, we're obviously looking at low unemployment rates, and so that's not necessarily the factor, although it may be in the demographics that you're talking about.
Right.
Talk about work and its connection to loneliness.
It's a good question, and I do want to also at some point touch on this unemployment rate because it's a bit of a fallacy the way it's being put forward. But I'll start with how our work lives are structured, and two key things are at play here. I think it was described so beautifully when someone said we essentially have these do not disturb cockpits at work. You have your computer and your phone and your multiple devices and your headphones in. And before, you used to walk by your colleague's desk and say, how's it going? You know, how was Johnny's performance this weekend? But now you feel like you're bugging someone if you're interacting or partaking in these small interactions that have built community over time. You used to walk into a boardroom 10 minutes before a meeting, and that's when you'd talk to your colleague. Oh, how was your weekend? How is this going? I'm sorry you're struggling with that. Or, oh, I have a friend who knows a little something about that. Why don't I put you guys in touch? That kind of the value of social capital, right? Instead, you walk into a boardroom now, and what do you see? Right? Everybody's head down. No one's talking. So we're losing that social capital in the workplace. And so even though we're connected, I've been working with you for 5 years or 10 years, I don't know the first thing about you. You have kids, I've been working with you for a decade, I didn't even know. You know, and that, our relationships aren't built in these large sweeping movements where you go on a week-long vacation with someone and you know them at their core. They're built over time, small interactions over a period of time that don't really exist anymore because we're all so withdrawn into ourselves, into our own devices. And part of that is that there's an increasing demand for us to do 50 million different things in a day. And part of it is that it's more comfortable to draw into yourself than it is to sit there and kind of awkwardly say, what am I going to talk to this person about? But that's meaningful, right? That's important that we take the time and we say, what would possibly be important for me to discuss with this colleague? That's how you get to know people, and that's how we build a fabric of connection. Also, with work life, something that I think is important to notice is because of technology, it's eking into every aspect of our lives. You're expected to be accessible 24/7, more or less. It used to be that you'd clock out at the end of the day and you'd come back the next morning. Now it's, oh, I sent you an email at 9 p.m. last night, and it's 7:30 in the morning. Why haven't I heard back from you? Well, I was sleeping, I was putting my kids to bed, and I was spending time with my spouse. And that used to be protected time, but that feeling is gone now. And it's, for better or worse, you know, I think people in a lot of ways are more productive. It can benefit the companies in the long run, sure. But when we don't have this separation, there tends to be a higher degree of burnout. People tend to be more frustrated with their jobs. And there's also an underlying level of anxiety of when's the next time I'm going to buzz? Am I going to be able to respond fast enough? And is my job going to be at jeopardy because I'm not available 24/7?
So let's go to that piece about the unemployment rates and the story that doesn't tell regarding the particular middle-aged male demographics in particular.
Yeah. So our unemployment rate, it's low. It looks good. It looks like we're doing well. But what the story doesn't tell you is that for every person who's unemployed, there's actually 3 people right now who are not looking for work. And they are not included in the unemployment statistic, which makes it kind of an antiquated indices, actually, you could argue. And so what are those other 3 individuals doing for the one person who's out of work? A lot of them are in school. Okay, so for some of them, it's your typical undergraduate degree that takes about 4 or 5 years, if you will, maybe longer at some public schools where it's hard to get the classes you need. But for others, it's, I was in the workforce, I didn't love my job, or I had trouble finding a job, I'll go back to school. Because we exist in a society that values education and it values degrees. So if I'm not valuable enough how I am, why don't I go back to school? And some people wholeheartedly go back to school. Other people will go back to school and kind of dabble in classes here, dabble in classes there. But regardless, because they're in this education realm, they're not part of the unemployment statistic. So there's a story there that's not being told. When you control for those who are out getting an education, we still see that the rate of idle Americans is what they're referred to. Those who are out of work and not looking for work, therefore not included in our unemployment statistic. Even when we control for education, the rate of idle Americans is still increasing. So what's going on there? I don't know exactly, but I can tell you what they're doing more or less. And it's a little bit heartbreaking, so bear with me here. The answer is not a whole lot. They're not really contributing to their home lives in a meaningful way. They're not really contributing to civic society in a meaningful way. On average, they're watching about 2,000 hours of TV or screen time a year, which is the equivalent of a full-time job. About half of them are on daily pain prescriptions. Of those daily pain prescriptions, 2/3 of them are opioid prescriptions, which we know are very high drugs of abuse. About half of the people out of work, or sorry, I apologize, 1 in 5 Americans is now on Medi-Cal, okay, which means that the government, due to financial reasons, is actually funding a lot of people being out of work and paying for the drugs that they are receiving. And it's when you're on disability or getting support through Medi-Cal, it's not a lot of support that you're getting, it's not a lot of funding, but it's just enough where essentially it is a paid alternative to permanent employment. And so you can argue it creates a whole new definition of dependency on government when we look at what's at play here. So our unemployment rate's low, but there's more to that story.
Yeah.
There's more to that story.
One of the other institutions we discuss in the A Way Forward document is faith and religion. And the way that we describe it in that document is to understand that there really are 2 points of connection in faith. One is obviously to a supreme being, and the other is that faith communities often provide other points of connection and community for people. So there's both the vertical and the horizontal,
Absolutely,
if you will.
absolutely.
And wondered if you had mentioned it in your remarks, but I wonder if you could go a little bit deeper in talking about the relationship between loneliness and disconnection from faith institutions.
Absolutely. It's a good question. I'm really glad that you brought it up because it's very important. What we know is that Americans are now ascribing to specific faiths less than they ever have, and they're partaking in religious activities, communal religious activities, less than they ever have. In the social science data surrounding this, they're called the nuns, N-O-N-E-S, not N-U-N-S.
That would be a lot different.
Ironic and not really fitting, yeah. So this group of nuns, if you will, they're people who maybe have religious faith but don't ascribe to a specific religion, or are atheists, or they're just not fitting into a specific mold, okay? And we're seeing the rate of these nuns increasing. And what's interesting is they're not really going to church, they're not praying, they're not partaking in the communities, but 80% of our nuns say that they believe in God. And 50% of them say that they believe in God with absolute certainty. So why aren't we participating? What's going on here? And you've talked a little bit about the increasing individualism that America has been facing. This is a trend that's been going on for almost a decade at this point. Each generation is consistently more individualistic than previous generations. But around the turn of the century, 2010, it took a very steep increase, okay? And so we're now more individualistic, and I think this is why we're also seeing a rise actually in some of the evangelical church participation, because it's more my religion, my relationship with my Savior. It's far more individualistic. So where is the role in that for going to church or partaking in these particular activities or giving back in this community if it's just your individual relationship? I'm not at all like blaming the evangelical church. I don't want you to think that, but we are seeing a shift towards a more individualistic relationship with our faith, and that's at play here. But what's also going on is there's a protective element of faith, and it's community faith in particular. And I'll bring up a study that was done by Tyler Vanderweel out of Harvard, actually. He looked at roughly 90,000 nurses over a 15-year period and looked at their suicide rates. And he found that those who ascribed to a specific religion had a suicide rate that was half the general population. Those who went to a religious service once a week were 5 times less likely to commit suicide than the general population. And those who went more than once a week didn't have a single suicide during that 15 years, which I think is very telling and brings back to your 2 points early on. Why? What is protective about that? One, we're living in community. It's the act of actually going to these services. He looked at a bunch of stuff. Is it the scripture reading? Is it the daily prayer? And by and large, he found that it was partaking in these religious activities in a community that was protective. And so coming back to this idea that we're isolated and we really do need to and we benefit from living in a community. So that was part of it. Two, the other part is that it provides meaning, okay? If you look through the scriptures and you look through Bibles, it's not a story of rainbows and unicorns and everything is happy and everything's easy. It's actually a story of incredible pain and sacrifice for a meaning that transcends any of us. And it's finding meaning in pain that is a message that's often shared through religion. And that's important because all of us are going to suffer and struggle at various points in our life. And religion is a way that we can help to provide meaning and tell people, look, you're not alone in this, but there is hope, and your pain and your struggle is part of something bigger, and to hold on, essentially.
I wanted to draw just this past Sunday in the, I don't know if you saw this, in the New York Times review section, social psychologist Dr. Clay Routledge wrote a piece titled "Suicides Have Increased. Is This an Existential Crisis?" And I just wanted to quote a couple sentences from that and then ask you a question off of that. He writes, and I quote, "As a behavioral scientist who studies basic psychological needs, including the need for meaning, I am convinced that our nation's suicide crisis is in part a crisis of meaninglessness. Fully addressing it will require an understanding of how recent changes in American society, changes in the direction of greater detachment and a weaker sense of belonging, are increasing the risk of existential despair." So one of the other items that we raise as an important institution of connection is actually a nationalism rightly understood. That begins with a connection to a local community, and then those muscles, essentially those civic muscles formed, then can then be expressed kind of up the chain. And you mentioned in especially the demographic that was not working in the low labor participation rates, that they were not engaging in other ways, also not real civic engagement, volunteering or whatever. I wonder if you could speak a little bit to at least the argument that we're trying to make here, that our community, state, and nation are also points of connection and can provide, rightly understood, and let me be clear, it can be wrongly understood, but rightly understood that it's important to defend these as institutions of connection.
Absolutely. And I think that's the core message through all of this, is how can we bring ourselves back together through what we do have available to us, both on the local and more national level. What's interesting is tying back to this notion of meaninglessness and lacking a sense of belonging. It comes into question, what are people's identities? Okay? If you understand who you are and what you stand for and what you are not willing to put up with when things go awry, how you would work to get back on track because it's not pleasurable to you, that's very different than what we're starting to see in society, which is where people really have these very shallow definitions of an identity. And I'll throw it back to you. I think that
Please don't.
there's no.
I'm not ready.
So how can we create identity is the question here. I think we're starting to touch on a lot of things that are making our current understanding of identity a little more superficial and shallow. We're not partaking in groups like we used to. Maybe our religious ties are more narrow, superficial, and individualistic than they were before. The types of interactions we're having with people, either in person or via the internet, are almost meaningless because they're so superficial. And so what are people's identities anymore? And I think when we spoke a couple weeks ago, we talked even, people are apolitical, or I'm not sure if I belong to a party. We're starting to see people hedging their identities, unwilling to commit one way or another. And that's part of the problem. Not everyone's identity has to be in agreement, but we essentially have people who more or less stand for nothing. So we're falling for anything, and then we're falling into despair because of it, is the core issue. So anything that we can do on a local, state, national level to bring people together to bolster a sense of identity is actually exactly what we need.
Yeah, and I think the argument that we're trying to make through the American Project is that our identities geographically are being lost. And in that we are, and I hadn't thought about it in those terms, that all forms of connection are, and as it relates to our identity, are being lost. But certainly how we identify ourselves as, you know, I live in Santa Monica, that's in the state of California, it's in the United States of America. Those, for millennia, where we have lived has provided some sense of connection or identity. It's in many of our names, and certainly in many of our family histories. And it's interesting, I was asked to speak at a class at another Southern California college that shall remain nameless to undergraduate students. And I was talking about this importance of, you know, me being one of 3 conservatives who lives in Santa Monica, but the fact that I will defend the identity and virtue of Santa Monica to my death. I did not grow up there, but I will defend it. And one of the responses I got back was, from one of the students there, was about, well, you know, various places where you lived and stuff, they've got a lot of problems, there are a lot of bad things in the history, and really trying to find ways to disconnect me from what I was trying to defend, which in part is part of my identity. And it was almost reflexive, but what I said at the time was, unless you love where you live, you will never defend it. And in that, whether we're talking about Santa Monica or Fresno or California or the United States of America, I fear, and it's certainly the argument of this document, that unless we get back to that, finding those points of connection, and again, I want to be clear, and we're going to explore this in some of our other panels here. There have been those who have not been invited into this American project, and that's something that conservatism as a philosophy needs to address. But I don't think we've counted the cost as it relates to this issue of loneliness by believing that there's nothing that we should love about where we live and where we're from. So I digress.
Yeah, no, I'll piggyback off that because I think it ties back to our conversation surrounding the workforce pretty well, actually. If you look back to like early 1970s, Case and Deaton referred to it as the blue-collar aristocracy, right? There was union jobs. You'd go in, there was a certain amount of security. The longer you worked, the more you made, the more valued you were by a company. And it allowed you to essentially access the American dream. Mm-hmm. You had the ability to support a family, and there was a certain amount of security. So let's get married, let's have kids, and let's move forward with this. That doesn't exist anymore. Mm-hmm. When we're looking especially at our working class group here, you can work for a long period of time, but you're not valued anymore. You're not necessarily making more money. You're not necessarily getting more raises because of it. And so that security isn't there. So we're actually seeing large portions of America who, like you said, weren't necessarily invited into this conversation, who have never developed that sense of identity and loyalty to where they are, who they are, and what they're doing, because why would they be loyal to this company? They've only been there for 6 months. They'll probably ultimately have to move on to another minimum wage starting level job until that one gets shipped overseas or whatever it may be. Because of that, their families are moving around a lot. They can't afford to access the American dream. They feel hesitant to get married, to have kids. Because of that, we're seeing a fair amount of flux in the homes, father figures coming in and out because we don't have this institution of marriage underpinning and providing stabilities for the family. And so what identity should these people be defending? I don't think they have one, is the problem. They have nothing to hold on to and say, this is who I am and this is what I stand for, and we're not giving them anything to hold on to.
Well, I think we should be thankful that I think our friends and relatives in the United Kingdom appear to have an answer. I don't know if you saw, but recently the Conservative Prime Minister Theresa May announced the creation of a commission on loneliness.
I love it. I love it.
The ironies are just saturated here. In fact, there is an actual loneliness minister, which shows that this is a Western issue, right? It's not just the United States. But at the same time, it questions what is the role of government. You had mentioned that some of the issues may actually be exacerbated by some government programs. But government is an institution as well, and that's also an argument that we make in the Way Forward document. What role, at what level, is there a role for government in responding to this crisis?
Well, I'm glad you asked. I was worried. I said, I think he's going to ask this question. And I'm a physician, in full disclosure, right? You need help with your medications or your lab work, I can help you there. But this is, I think, the entire point of this conference, right, is to bring up this conversation and say, what can we do as an institution? What could be the role of government? What could be the role of civil structures to help aid us here? And I think there certainly is one. As far as what the specific answer is, I don't know. I will push that out to you guys. That's what we're here to discuss, right? But I do think we need to know that there is a role for it, and we've kind of touched on some of the nuances. In many ways, we can help people, we can provide support. There's some growing issues with the globalization, jobs being shipped overseas, less job security because of that. We know that that's an issue. The flip side, like we talked about, is too much government support can essentially cut people off at the knees and make them unable to help themselves. So the answer is somewhere in between. I think if I knew the answer to that, I would probably be a very wealthy person not sitting right here. But I want us all to be talking about it because it's an important and it's a challenging question. And so if you guys have any ideas or questions on the topic, let's chat about it.
Yeah.
I want to ask a question about the demographics. There's this suicide rate that, what does it cover in demographics? Ages, male, female, what's the breakdown?
So it's everybody. It's everybody. It's everyone under the age of 75. I'll say that. Those over the age of 75 have actually always had a slightly higher suicide rate than the rest of the population. So since the turn of the century, 1999, 2000, right in there, we've seen skyrocketing suicide rates in all age demographics. The ones that have been most pronounced are our adolescents, in particular females between the age of 10 and 15. Their suicide rate has tripled. And then we've seen a doubling in the suicide rate for middle-aged, Caucasian, working-class males, in particular without a bachelor's degree. The females' suicide rate in the similar demographic was not far behind, but it was just a little bit lower. But across the board, all age demographics, all socioeconomic statuses, and all regions of the country are being affected by this.
Tim.
Thank you. Tim Carney, American Enterprise Institute and the Washington Examiner. I'd like to play devil's advocate for a second because I agree with everything you said, and that's always dangerous when we all agree. And so on the idea that this is Western navel gazing, there was Charles Murray, not in Coming Apart, in his book In Pursuit, suggested much of what we observe as rootlessness, emptiness, unhappiness comes from modernity, how modernity has, in a phrase, quote, taken the trouble out of things. And so that idea that what we're responding to with these discussions is things are too easy. We don't have to go to the neighborhood diner because now we have coffee makers that can make one cup for ourselves. That the economy is sort of sorting things a little better, and that provides us this magical entertainment. And we're perfectly free to go to the pub, but now we're 1/10 as likely to drink our alcohol out with our neighbors as we are at home because there's great refrigeration and we can have beer at home. We have espresso makers at home, television. All this stuff is stuff we want. We could socialize if we wanted to, but we don't. And so maybe what it is that things are made so easy for us that to look for another problem, we come here and we talk about how we're all isolated, even though we're choosing to be isolated, and the problem is really that things have become too easy for us.
Well, and I would just interject, by the way, that phrase, pain of living, is paraphrased from Tocqueville, who wrote that in book 2, in which he talked about really the eventual place for democratic societies was going to be a reliance on government to, quote, take away the pain of living. But I don't think that necessarily, you're talking about a cause, but that doesn't necessarily get away from the results that we're talking about here, right? But I wanted you to...
So I'm going to argue that was not a devil's advocate point. I actually think that feeds in beautifully into part of what's going on here. And everything is too easy, right? If you look at, Putnam has done a fair amount of work on this as well, looking at how society's changed. We're spending roughly 50% less time at the dinner table with our families. We're spending a third less time with our neighbors, just getting together, having a drink. And you're right, it's easier to be by yourself. It's been a long day. I'll just pop open a beer, hang out on the couch, and go to bed. We tend to gravitate towards what's easiest as a society. But how many times are you like, I don't really want to go, I've had a long day, and then you get to wherever you're going, you're like, that was great. I'm so glad I went. So it's that little hurdle up front that we're no longer getting over, and it's costing us greatly. And the question that I've been asking is, what are we doing instead of partaking in these activities? Why aren't we spending time with our neighbors? Why aren't we spending time at the dinner table? Because I think that starts to get back to some of our root causes here. The answer, by and large, is work is creeping into the home. If you look, to be honest with you, at the role technology has taken in our life, how much of our free time is spent with our face and our devices, it's alarming. And that free time used to be where we found our identity. Oh, I love going hiking, I love doing this on the weekends, and instead, our free time, maybe 1% of it is now spent doing things that we enjoy, as opposed to the 10 to 15% we may have had in previous years before our devices, which we're very much so addicted to. We know that at a neurologic level, we have studies showing that.
Well, Tim Cook just recently talked about when he did his own diagnostic, how much more time he was spending in his phone than he realized.
Yeah, and it's a true addiction.
Yeah.
We have the studies showing fMRI, the whole shebang, showing that dopamine is released in a similar pattern and similar pathways in our brain. Every time you like a photo, dopamine's released in the same way as it is when people take a hit of cocaine. So it's
I have
very
no idea
similar.
what you're talking about. John.
John Wood Jr., with a group called Better Angels, and I wanted to say, first of all, that Dr. Brockhammer, I think that this was precisely the right topic to begin this conference with respect to, because there's all sorts of things that are important to think about in the area of fiscal policy and so forth, but if we don't have a handle on what it means to live a meaningful life, then progress in all other areas feels a bit irrelevant to me. Having said that, I wanted to ask this question. It seems to me that all behavior exists upon a spectrum, and that it might seem that suicide is an extreme manifestation of other behavior, of the type of behavior that results from the sorts of psychological factors, depression, ostracization, that may lead to other self-destructive behaviors. Clinical psychologist Jordan Peterson, or as I like to call him, the other Peterson.
You're number one, of course.
Jordan Peterson has talked a bit about the psychological profiles of campus shooters, mass shooters. And in particular, if you look at some of the writings and diaries of some of the individuals responsible for events like Columbine, Aurora,
Right.
et cetera, you find a pattern of their being socially ostracized, immersed in the dark corners of the internet, that they have this bitterness towards the apathy of society in general. My question is, given the fact that you're claiming that we are in the midst of a number of unique societal factors that are leading to this broad suffering of social isolation, resulting in this epidemic of suicide, would it be fair to suspect that it may be that the proliferation of mass shootings, something that I think many people have a difficult time accounting for, is itself possibly an expression of this same general phenomenon?
Yeah, I think you're not far off in saying that. I do think that, like we said, Americans are lonely. We have angst, we have pain, and we're looking for an outlet for it. More often, we're seeing that outlet in suicide, but certainly these homicidal acts or these violent acts are another outlet that people turn to. And especially, not always are they teenagers or anything like that, but especially when you consider your adolescent demographic. There's already a fair amount of angst and misunderstanding going on with just being a teenager in general, and then we throw on top of it everything we've already talked about today. And then we add on, maybe a touch of violent video games, being exposed to very violent images their whole life, being desensitized to it, and you're looking for an outlet. Maybe suicide isn't your outlet. Is it too far off to say that violence towards others would be a potential outlet for this? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. I think you're really onto something with that.
Yes.
What about, speaking to the
I'm sorry?
Am I next?
I didn't know you had the mic. Go ahead.
I have the mic.
I didn't- And your name is Mike. How convenient.
So, are there any countries where that are modern and industrialized where people are happy and not committing suicide? And then the second thing is, long ago I read a book by Durkheim on suicide, and I think he said that Catholic countries a little less suicide than Protestant countries, but in Japan, total opposite, which is a high degree of social integration, but they weren't committing suicide, or they were committing a lot of suicide in Japan,
Right.
even though they had a lot of social integration. So we're the happy countries, and what about those anomalies?
So I have to tell you up front, a lot of the research we've done has been America-based, and I know same with a lot of the big social scientists that are, or economists that are looking at this. Case in Deaton actually just said with their most recent study, they're hoping to take the next one overseas. But what I will say is, it's affecting America the most. We've had the steepest increase, and it's an issue here, but it's affecting a lot of countries. Countries that we're seeing not as affected by it, interestingly enough, are a lot of the European countries. And an argument for that is actually that there is some increased government support surrounding, for example, single-parent households. There's a very specific set allowance that's relatively generous per child in that setting. So we're not seeing as much flux in the home, people grasping for relationships to try to provide the support their family needs, and then those relationships falling apart, and in turn creating a lot of downstream emotional and mental health effects. So it is a worldwide issue. America's seeing steep increases, but there are some pockets that are a little more isolated from it, and it's definitely worth looking into why are they isolated. That's just one example of how that country's been successful in this regard, but there's more there.
Yes, we had up front. Yes.
Here's a, what about the genie that's out of the bottle, where the culture is much more comfortable with devaluing life? And I don't mean just abortion. I mean, assisted suicide and the quality of life issue and all of this stuff. Is there a way? I mean, to me, it seems as though some of those things add into the whole suicide and alienation. Why be alive if I've got this pain? Why continue? Because there is such a devaluation now of human life. It's just not necessary anymore.
Right. And it's a good question. I'm glad you brought it up, because I was recently listening to a podcast discussing this with a university professor, and he says more often than not our collegiate American population is characterized by a healthy amount of superficial cynicism, right? We have very liberal campus communities, and if you're not questioning the man and you're not saying, well, this is wrong, and who are we to tell them that they're wrong or they're right, then you're not part of this conversation. But in doing that and being so skeptical and so cynical about everything that's been in place in America for so long, we're starting to put a fair amount of separation between essentially us and universal truths that used to exist. What is the value of human life? What does dignity in human life means? And we're not here to judge anyone or tell them that they're wrong and we're right, but we're not having conversations anymore on kind of a deep-rooted philosophical level of what's right and what's wrong and what are our values. We're having conversations instead way up here, and we're getting caught in the frills, but we have no agreement or meaningful conversations surrounding the deeper questions that are at play. And so very quickly things will spiral as we spend more time having these superficial conversations. All of a sudden we're not valuing human life, our own or others. And we've gotten away from that. No one's pulling us back down to these deep-rooted universal truths, and that's dangerous.
It seems like the media is pushing in this direction.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I don't know that there's any going back anymore.
So the way we consume media now is in like 30-second headlines. That's what we get, right? You have, and it has to be sensationalized. No one's going to sit down and, well, I hope they will. You're doing it right now, but sitting down and listening to an hour-long conversation about something that might be meaningful, people don't really do that anymore. And so they're looking for 30-second sensationalized clips. And what gets that? It's these headlines that, like you said, are meaningless, more or less. We're saying that this person's being ostracized and isn't that bad and we should blame this person, and no one's looking into that farther. And what we know is, so there is a role for media here. And I will tell you this also, there's something called the Werther effect. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it or not. Sorrows of Young Werther was a book that was written in the 1700s in Germany about a young man who committed suicide because he was thwarted in his romantic efforts towards a nice young woman. And he ended his life with a pistol. And what we saw following that, it was a big sensation, swept the country. Everybody was reading the book. Everyone was walking around with a newspaper article, talking about it, sharing it. What we saw following that was an overwhelming rash of suicides by a similar means in a similar setting. Young males would actually end their life with the same means, with a pistol, and they die with the newspaper or the book actually under their arm. And what does that tell us? That there's a huge role of media in how we discuss mental illness, how we discuss pain, suffering, the meaning of life, universal truths, all of this. The counter to that is there's something called the Papageno effect. And it was an opera in the 1800s where a young man was going to end his life, and friends came to him and said, don't do it. These are the reasons you have to live. We love you. We care about you. We support you. And he didn't do it. And that goes to show that essentially if we can surround people with positive examples and meaning in their life, we can actually protect them. But what we're seeing in media is so-and-so didn't end their life, doesn't get the attention. There was, I'm sorry, I gotta say it. There was a young woman down in South America who was considering physician-assisted suicide in the setting of cystic fibrosis. And she was traveling all around trying to find a doctor who would allow her to do this. And then she actually came into touch with a young woman who had survived, who had been contemplating taking her life, also had cystic fibrosis, and said, I wanted to live and this is why. And she decided not to end her life anymore. And she went from having ample press coverage to no press coverage. And her dad was livid. Why are we not telling this success story anymore? Why is that not a headline? And what does that say about us as consumers of media, that we don't want to hear the good, we just want to hold on to the bad?
Rosemary.
Thank you.
Really wonderful. But there are two words that I see missing. One is love, and one is God. No matter what religion you are, I don't care. It's just you have to have some sort of supreme being. If you have those two, you're going to have a wonderful attitude. And it's all attitude that a person has. Everyone goes through strife and hard luck and things like that. You're not going to have everything rosy. However, you must have a good attitude. I'm a former school teacher, elementary school teacher, and I loved my work. When I retired, I didn't want to just stay home, so I got myself busy. I had many, and I still have many projects.
That is
But
true.
that's me, and it keeps me busy, and I love it, and I bring other people in. But a person must be occupied and doing good, so those people will be happy. So remember that, and that's my feeling. And but you need those two words, God and your Savior, whichever religion you are. But you need that. You need that. See, everybody's shaking their head. A lot of people are shaking their head. And I want to tell you something. I had to get it off my chest. That's why I stood up and talked. But something else. We have a president that I think is wonderful. You listen to our president, Donald J. Trump. Every speech he gives, whatever speech it might be, he says love and God. Notice that.
Very good points, Rosemary. We have time for two more questions. We have one in the front, and then we'll get one back there.
I took some notes on the opening remarks that you made,
Yep.
so I want to include both of you in my thoughts. I wrote, shouldn't we find community outside of politics?
Mm-hmm.
And if not, if we find community within political engagement, don't the conservatives find roots in the idea of rugged individualism? And it's the left which more likely finds the politics of hope. And so while I'm respecting everything we're talking about, despair, alienation, suicide, at the political level, I'm really heartened by libertarians and rugged individualists and the political consequences of the American spirit of individualism. And I'm really concerned about communitarianism and unions and the academic world, which is groupthink, and lots of community-oriented thought. I don't think that's going to get us where we want to go politically. I can't speak for everybody, but the politics of conservatism, I'm not sure will be assisted by communitarianism over individualism.
Well, there are a lot of, stick around for the next panel. But I hope you, if you haven't, you read the A Way Forward document, because it really is an attempt to define that. A couple things. First, Professor Emeritus here, Gordon Lloyd, recently co-wrote a book on rugged individualism that I'll make sure you have a copy of. Because that book, in many ways, goes into the origins of that phrase and the understanding, going back to Tocqueville, that in his section when he's talking about individualism rightly understood, there is an individualism rightly understood, but there is also one wrongly understood. And I think if anything comes out of this conversation is that there is a radical individualism that is un-American and frankly does not understand one of the founding principles of the country, which really is making decisions based on public deliberation, right? It's not a matter of, and has never been the case. You look at the founding, I mean, these were contentious arguments that happened over the future of a nation, but they were done by and large in a spirit of deliberation, that nobody was going to get their way. And as it pertains to this idea of identity, I think there is a major difference between communitarianism and groupthink. Those don't necessarily have to be the same thing. I love Santa Monica. Not many people think the way I do in Santa Monica. And I think this understanding of diversity within community, right? One of our panels tomorrow is going to be, is pluribus now set against unum? I think if we can argue anything across the political spectrum, we don't really have a sense of the unum. That's essentially what this American project is about, right? And maybe it has to be redefined, right? But there is a pluribus based on a radical individualism that's both on the left and the right, that I think if there's any quality or ethic of an engaged American citizen, it is one who plays well with others and can come to a sense in common in making decisions for the good of a community. So I'm so glad you raised that, because I think really that tension between individualism wrongly understood and rightly understood is really a tension inside the conservative movement. But as we point out in the document, there is also a radical individualism on the left as well that does not seek an unum. And in that, I think some of the problems that we're talking about here that are essentially the foundation of what we think we need to respond to are ones we really need to seek an individualism rightly understood that is also a communitarianism rightly understood. I don't know if you have...
No, I think well said.
One more, yes.
Hi, my name's Shelby. I'm very young, obviously. I finished my undergrad last week, so you all have much more wisdom than I do collectively, but I hope to offer a little bit of insight and hopefully a call to action on this whole mental health thing that we've been talking about. I personally suffer from anxiety and depression and suicidal thoughts sometimes, so I personally understand exactly what's going on, and I'd like to bring this all back to the idea of identity. And we're saying that, we don't exactly have an identity as an individual, as a society anymore, but I would like to rather challenge you to say maybe you are not accepting of what our identity is. You know, the traditional nuclear family working 9 to 5 may not be what everyone's identity is. Some people may be more willing to have a child on their own, to not have a family, to not want to work all the time. And instead of pushing everyone into the box of you don't have an identity because your identity isn't my identity, I think we all need to be a little bit more accepting and a little bit more open-minded and see people for who they are and listen to what they want to be instead of trying to put them into this box of who we are. And most importantly, by not labeling people with mental illness as someone with a mental illness, because whether or not you try to do it or not, there is a stigma with mental illness, and people think that, you know, people that are depressed, people that have mental illness, people that are suicidal are less than, and they're not less than. We just struggle differently than you do. And it's all about being open-minded, being compassionate, and building a community for everyone, whether or not you're liberal, conservative, you know, mentally ill, not young, old, it doesn't matter. And I think that that's the only way that we're gonna like find a solution and get through this is by being compassionate to everyone and to not judge them and to realize that underneath, deep down, mental illness is an illness, and no amount of love, compassion, religion, policy is going to change that. We just need to be able to be there for each other and to understand what's going on, and that's the best thing that I think we can do for this, but anything you have to add would be more than appreciated.
Francie, why don't we
Yeah.
close with you on that?
Yeah, thank you for commenting, Shelby, and congratulations on the graduation, by the way. That's great. So she brings up some good points. There's a fair amount of stigma associated with mental illness and the diagnosis, and I've heard that a lot. Let's get rid of the term mental illness. We've chased changing terminology for a long period of time surrounding mental illness. And so my counter argument to that is it's not actually the words at all, but it's our behavior and our reaction towards it, like you said. Why does there have to be a stigma associated to it? If you break your arm, you're not going to come into my office and feel ashamed, but if for some reason you're depressed or considering ending your life, you might feel ashamed and it might actually prevent you from seeking help. So this is something that applies to everyone across the board, regardless of religious party or geographic region, is that you're right, we do need to be accepting and understanding and realize that mental illness plagues everyone, just like medical illness plagues everyone. It's just oftentimes harder to see, and there is a role to help and support and to be compassionate there. I think that's a beautiful message that you're sending. And the question that we're asking today is not to fit everyone into a box or say if you do it this specific way, we will solve your problem. It's that over time, we know that there's been certain structures in society, maybe within the government or within our civic organizations, that work to bring people together, to create identity, and to provide support. They might not be perfect for everyone, but since we can't help everyone on an individual level today in this room, we can start to look at how we can. And that starts to apply to more structural, broad topics, which I think will be the conversation of the rest of the weekend moving forward. How can we, from the resources we have available and the places that we're sitting in, work to reach people and help people? Not necessarily fit them in a box, but just to do what we can from where we are to change things and provide support.
And on that, please join me in thanking Dr. Francis Poindexter.